Welcome to Silver Lining for Learning, our very first episode for the year of 2026. On behalf of all of the hosts, I would like to wish everyone a very happy new year, and we can't wait to get back together and bring you a series of amazing shows this year. So today with me are Professor Chris Dede from Harvard University, Professor Punya Mishra from Arizona State University, and Professor Curt Bonk from Indiana University. Um, so, so today is our first show. It's also a host reflection show. So let's just kick that off. Anyone would like to jump in to get us started?
Sure, I can do that. It's good to see all of you. I've been gone for almost the entire month, missed the last episode of last year, but it really feels good to see all of you. I wish Zao were here, but I know he's traveling somewhere, I'm sure, somewhere in the world. Um, so I was looking up, like today is January 3rd, and I was looking up what had happened on January 3rd. It just sort of popped into my feed. So, 1933, President Roosevelt started this thing called the National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis, which was this fight against polio. And this is one of the great successes of the human race. I remember when I was a child growing up in India, I had friends who had polio, right? And the reason I'm bringing it up is like we are now seeing a backlash against all this advancement that we have done in eradicating some of the most troublesome diseases. We have measles spreading in this country. So I want to start this year on a downer, but I think that's something we need to acknowledge and recognize that there is a lot of what I would call sort of anti-science and the kind of stuff that's happening. And I think that it also feeds into education, where a lot of myth making about what AI can do or cannot do. So I think that's one of those themes that is something that I think in this year going forward we will need to be addressing and talking about. Like to me, that's a failure of education at a fundamental level that we are. I mean, just leave it at that. But another thing that happened 1977 was as a company was incorporated with Steve Jobs and Wozniak, which I think created our careers at some level. The rise of the personal computer leading to the internet and blah blah blah. This, I mean, our lives would have been very different. All of our lives on this planet would have been very different. And I think what Apple did, making this computer for the rest of us, so to speak, really galvanized a lot of change, good and bad, and all of those things in between. But I remember when I first graduated from engineering and went to design school, and I saw a Mac for the first time, and that was transformational for me. I had gone in wanting to make educational film and saw this new technology, which was very different from the PCs that I had programmed on before, or the mainframes that I'd programmed on before, and sort of pointed me and said that my interests in design and science and all of those things could come together in this technology. So I think that's 1977. And the final one is, I don't know if this makes sense, but 2009, when this fictional character by the name of Satoshi Nakamoto started the first Bitcoin mining happened today. I have no idea what crypto means. I don't understand it. My son works in that industry. I have tried to quiz him about it. I come back more confused than before. But also, I think that it speaks to some of these changes that are happening in the way we interact and, the economies work and so on. So again, something I think that we will be in some shape or form talking about in the year to come. So that was my intro in the sense of, looking back in order to look forward, But I think that the 1977 one with Apple Computer, to me, personally speaking, is the most transformational of the lot because I can literally point to a date, almost a date and time when I first got introduced to the Macintosh, to HyperCard, to programming on this device, to the fact that of the WYSIWYG interface that that you can drag and drop things, and that what was happening in zeros ones behind the machine could actually, we need not have to think about that. We could work at it at a very transparent level. It seems so obvious today that I can drag a file and drop it, that I can type, and I can select something and say bold and, so on. But those were transformational sort of interface changes, which actually brought this technology into every home, and now of course we have things like this and all of that. So I think that, to me, that it happened on this date, that we are meeting on the first episode of 2026, I think seems kind of appropriate. I don't know, Kurt, Chris?
Sure, I can jump in on that and do a little historical reflection like you have done. Um, you know, I come from the business world, and the last firm that I worked for before entering graduate school made the most dense circuit boards in the world. In El Segundo, California, we had a programmer there who came up with a computer program to make it so. And we leased our software. I was in charge of that. Got interested in computers and software because of that. We had Hewlett Packard as a client, General Electric, General Motors. We had everybody, Hughes Aircraft, Westinghouse, all that. But we were a small firm. This is mid 80s. And on the weekends, I would go into the office and I was a CPA, I would do the budgets using VisiCalc, okay, before Lotus 123, but Lotus 123 as well. And then Symphony came along. But yeah, I was a wizard at spreadsheets and all that. I don't know how to use Excel. I mean, a little bit of Excel, but back in the day, I could do all that, but you lose those skills over time, they rusted out, you know what I mean? And so, I do remember the first PC I had. I remember, you know, yeah. So I remember the VisiCalc days. I remember the two floppy. I remember my TRS Radio Shack computer, Commodore 64, all that stuff. Um, but my boss, Clarence, he didn't believe anything off a PC. And so I do these fancy spreadsheets and budgets and predictions of sales for the coming year, and put it on his desk, and he would ignore it and put it in a desk drawer. Okay. And this company was making the most dense circuit boards in the world. We were a leader, and we went for profit. We went on the stock exchange that one of the years I was there. I was only there 2.5 years. And the company went under because it didn't change with the times. They were true blue IBM mainframe all the way. They didn't believe anything off a PC. It had to be off a mainframe computer. And so, I got a little frustrated. I'm still frustrated today I can put this on the record. I'm frustrated by my own university, although we have a football team right now. We have some issues that we're dealing with right now. But I was totally frustrated back, this is 1985 and 86, going off to grad school before Lydia was born. And I then worked for a software company as selling, cold calling people to buy our software. I was reading software or writing software or whatever it was at the time, and then built my own companies. I built a company that did like SurveyMonkey. We are called SurveyShare. So I've been at this for a while, and I see the evolution, but it's ramped up the last 3 years since the emergence of AI. But yeah, there are a lot of anniversary marks that we could point to, significant dates that we could point to in our evolution of our professional interests. But I would say the late or the early 80s, when not everyone, when a lot of people were starting to get a personal computer and play around and try it out and see what could be done. In the accounting firm I worked for before that, we had word processors, okay, not software. Word processors were people with titles, okay? The designated word processor. I wrote a forward to a book that just came out, an AI book. Actually, it's an afterword about word processing. And I was never a good writer in terms of handwriting. And so people discounted my writing altogether. I was put on probation at the CPA firm because they couldn't read my writing. But we had word processors, then people could read my writing. And then I, published hundreds of things since then. But, when I got to grad school, we built a set of computer prompts within WordPerfect. We repurposed WordPerfect and used keyboard macros to record keystrokes. So that was 87, 88, 89. So I went from the early 80s and word processors were people to the end of the 80s where word processors were tools to extend the mind, you know? And so it was an interesting evolution as an computer software as an augmentative aid, whether it was note-taking systems or concept mapping systems or outlining tools or computer prompts as we developed with critical and creative thinking prompts within WordPerfect. So I was starting to toy around with that. And at the time, I read Bob Cosma's article about computers as kind of tools. And we had the famous Clark and Cosma debate at the time. Since then, Bob Cosma has become a good friend of mine. He's been on, been a guest in my classes. But I've seen this evolution take place, and it's interesting. Maybe I can comment on it some more, but anyways, I wrote on this. If you guys want to read my article about the what it was like working with truly word processors and handing things off. And they had the best position in the company. They were next to the partner's office. The word processors were golden. I mean, they were treated really well. Anyways, Chris has a point he wants to make. I'll probably come back to some of this later on.
So I also will take a historical perspective, but I'll attach a backstory to mine. So some of you may know that there's a British comedian named Jack Whitehouse who is very, very funny and who put together a series of shows called Travels with My Father that are hilarious. And one of the things I learned in Travels with My Father is that the reigning British monarch every January gives what's known as the King's Speech or the Queen's Speech, in which they, provide advice to the entire British nation. And I found myself thinking about what I would give as the King's Speech this year. As his father does a very funny King's Speech. He does about 40 minutes. I'm going to try to do about 4. If you look at the last 6 years, starting in January 2020, there have been at least 3 events that have knocked everyone's life sideways. One of them, of course, is the pandemic. The second one is the advances that Gen AI has made. And a third now is the rise of authoritarian governments across the world and a great deal of political and economic chaos that we wake up to every morning, including this morning. And the interesting thing is that my advice for all 3 is exactly the same. Don't let anyone or anything do your thinking for you, including me. So if you're worried now about another pandemic or about the fact that as Punya described, diseases that were thought to be conquered or eradicated are now coming back, don't let anybody do your thinking for you on this, because they're coming back in part because of other people's flawed thinking. If you're thinking about using Gen AI and you have a worthwhile use for it, well and good, but don't let it do your thinking for you, because its thinking has a lot of problems still, despite what the tech companies are telling you. And if no matter what your ideology, no matter what your political affiliation, no matter what country you're living in this present chaos and uncertainty and disruption, don't let anybody do your thinking for you. Don't let the head of your party or the head of your nation or anybody do your thinking for you. Because a lot of the reasons that we've had these 3 things create such a mess is because people are letting something else do their thinking for them. And that gets me back, I think, to why I entered education in the first place, and something that we've kind of lost sight of. When formal schooling began, at least one of the motivations, at least one of the primary goals, was to teach people to do their own thinking not to have to rely on the king or the duke or the pope or the local monk or whoever to do your thinking for you. Learn to read, learn to write, learn the curriculum, and then take charge of your life and do your own thinking for you. And we've been distracted from that. We're all worried about test scores, and we're all worried about should we teach math by inquiry or memorization, and we're all worried about a number of other things that are legitimate kinds of process questions, but they're individual trees, and we've lost sight of the forest, which is that what we should be asking is when a person graduates, are they capable and ready and willing to do their own thinking? Because if they're not, then it doesn't matter what the test scores are or what the content was or anything else, we've failed. And the world as it is now is only going to get worse. So that's my version of the King's speech for January. Lydia, your turn.
So I'm really curious to hear from Lydia because you have these three fogies who, remember word processors and, as being real humans and, floppy disks which you could change. So what was your first connection, like interaction with technology?
And
I
Lydia
was
can probably define what Bitcoin is for you, Punya, and explain it really well,
I knew.
Bitcoin. I remember when it first emerged, and then it is crazy to thinking about we are constantly living through history. Like right now, we are making history. It's only when we look back, it's like, oh wow, that thing. But the history is also in this moment. It's kind of mind-boggling to think that. I think like hearing, the reflection from you three very esteemed scholars and I was just really amazed at these how quickly the world has evolved and this constant um change in terms of what will constitute a good education or what is considered an educated person and what is considered of having like literacy. Like right now, AI literacy is like the buzzword, but nobody was talking about AI literacy probably 3 years ago, maybe to an extent, but it was never the same extent. And before having some like literacy in technology means like at least when I went to primary school was how to open a word processor and type a couple words and then how to like surf the internet and like you are literate in terms of like, in the digital world, but now it's completely different. And then, Curt said like at some point there was someone's job is being a word processor, and this is a considered really well-paid job, but this job doesn't really exist anymore. So I'm just wondering like right now it's really hard to anticipate the change that's going to, come to us in the next 5, 10 years. And, maybe there are certain jobs that we consider really like well regarded will simply disappear. It will, but when we look back, it's like, oh, of course, like, it seems that it is going to disappear. So I'm just wondering, like, looking forward, how, how do we really prepare ourselves and students, the younger generation for this constant changing world. And last year what was significant for me because it was also my first year as assistant professor and teaching, my very first class as like solo instructor and completely designing this course. So one of the real concerns among all of my students was where we're going to find a job because we know as a fact that entry-level jobs are quickly diminishing. And so they kind of get into a chicken egg problem. Without experience, you can't find a job, but without having an entry-level job, you can't get experience. So there's a lot of anxiety among students. Like, we have all this education, we did all of this, but like, are we going to find a job? If so, where are we going to find a job? And what are the things we need to equip ourselves with, empower ourselves with? So I'm just wondering, what are your thoughts about this?
So if I can jump in, I'm going to tie it back to something that Chris said, and I'm going to sort of push back a little bit, Chris, um, at what you said about this idea that, don't let anybody else think for you. So one of the things that you will find very often, if you are a vaccine denier, for instance, the statement, I did the research on this, right? And so, yes, they did the research in the sense of they went and looked up some sites or whatever, and there was a confirmation bias because of certain groups that you are aligned with, and you read what they say and you go from there. And so I'm not exactly 100% certain just saying that think for yourself is the answer, because I think everybody is thinking that they're thinking for themselves. Nobody is claiming to be, I just follow whatever whoever says, right? In some ways, in fact, if I look at myself, I'm not going and doing the research on the efficacy of vaccines. I'm depending on experts. I'm looking at certain sources that I think are more credible. I'm basing it on my personal experience. So all of us in some weird way are doing the same thing. And so I wonder about, like, what does it mean to think for oneself? What are the implications of that? I mean, how does that actually play out? And one of the things that I learned like a couple of years ago, which I think might be one way of thinking our way through it. And the way I would describe it is, like, for instance, I'd always thought curiosity to be a positive virtue. I'd always like, yeah, curiosity. If you're curious about the world, you ask questions of the world and so on, that's a good thing, right? Turns out that there are two kinds of curiosity. And this is where I think science and research comes into giving us insight into the world. So there is one which is deprivation, that psychologists call deprivation curiosity, and another one is called discovery curiosity. So deprivation curiosity is this urge, is this discomfort with not knowing and finding some answer to fill that gap. And once you get that answer, you are good to go. You're not questioning that any further. So it might be, these left-wing, whatever scientists are trying to force vaccines on us so that they can put whatever in our bloodstream to track our movement. And that's your answer to things. And then you're content with that. While what discovery curiosity does, it always asks more questions. And the difference between the two is, in one case you are satisfied with the answer and you just leave it at that, while the other one is always asking more. And I think that that's the distinction. And I think connecting back to Lydia, what you're saying is that since we don't know what the future is going to be, definitely. I mean, we know that. I mean, we have had that, like, silver lining for learning is a classic example of that, right? We started during the pandemic, and here we are with AI and all the other changes that have happened in between, geopolitical, rise of authoritarianism, blah, 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 all of those things happening in real time as we are talking about. So to me, I think what we need to be thinking about is inculcating this idea of discovery curiosity as opposed to deprivation curiosity, which, and most of school, if you see the way we have done it, is like get the right answer and then we are done. It's actually scratching the deprivation curiosity instinct, which is, if you can give, this is the definition of Newton's first law, you are done, as opposed to truly engaging with, what does it mean to have a body in a state of rest? What does rest mean? What is this? So on and so forth. And I think that, to me, that's one way of sort of possibly thinking about how we think about education going into the future. So I don't know what you guys think about that. Chris, I know you.
Well, I don't think you and I disagree at all. It's obviously hard to come up with any slogan of 6 words or so that's going to be completely comprehensible. There's almost no topic at any level now on which you can find complete agreement. You're always going to find sources that contradict one another. And then you have to decide which source you want to believe. And because the world is constantly changing, you have to revisit that decision frequently. So I think that's what I mean by don't let anyone do your thinking for you. And the sort of thought process that you described, it seems to me, is a good example of what I mean by that. So I don't think we need to get bogged down with semantics about this,
Sure.
but I do agree that thinking for yourself necessarily involves education. And what we mean by a really good education is it produces somebody who's capable of thinking for themselves in the way that we're talking about it across a wide range of subjects, what we might call the classic liberal arts education, as opposed to somebody who learns only how to build bridges. And for anything else, they've got to just take people's word about it, whether it's Bitcoin or whatever.
Sure. No, I didn't think that we disagreed fundamentally on this. So I was doing a little bit of a straw man argument there. So, Curt.
Yeah, we need people who know how to make decisions and problem solve and can run a company, can run a country. But today looks like we're going to be running another country, but this is an apolitical show, just on the news wire if you got it. Okay, curiosity. I wrote my book, Adding Tech Variety, about motivational principles. Tech variety stands for tone, encouragement. Third one's curiosity. Variety, autonomy, interactivity, tension, and engagement and yielding products. Anyways, curiosity chapter was the most downloaded chapter in the book, and it had hundreds of thousands of downloads. But apparently, people are curious about the curiosity chapter. And that was consistent over time. Eventually, the counter broke. So I actually do not know how many chapters were downloaded there, but it's a start. It's a place that people can get some ideas about building curiosity within enhanced digital environments. It was my attempt, anyhow. And these chapters, anyone listening here or running on the trails listening to this podcast, is free. You can download it. Adding Tech Variety book right off my homepage. So if you want to build curiosity, if you want to learn how to support and give feedback, if you want to learn how to create goals, goal-based scenario kinds of learning, it's all in there. Just even social ice-breaking kinds of things. Again, it's my attempt at creating a framework that's more about creating a more engaging learning environment. I want to go to Chris's point about and Punya's, both of you talked about this dramatically changing world that we're in, and in education, it's hard to keep up. I mean, I'm thinking about putting my syllabus together after the show today. And do I leave it the same as last year at this time, or how much do I change it? I mean, can I keep up? Am I doing justice to the field, teaching emerging learning technologies in the spring, 2 sections of it, one online, one face-to-face? I'm a little daunted about what's new. I mean, I'll ask you guys, maybe I'll be my ending question for you, but I think in a way, these dramatic changes are also causing a shift in our inquiry methodologies, or at least a shift in focus, in that I've never seen so many calls for systematic reviews of the research than I've seen since 2020. I mean, in fact, I'm on 2 of those special issues. I edited them, but scoping reviews, systematic reviews, meta-analyses, just general literature reviews, they're exploding because the studies out there are getting or there's too many for one to keep track of. Florence Martin, who we might want to have on the show at some point, she's at NC State. She has a brand new book on systematic reviews of the research and how to do them. We might get a couple people on the show, maybe during this spring or summer, talking about the importance of systematic reviews and how to do them. I'm sure Florence, I could work on that if anyone's interested. But so just a couple of things, just free of thought, free thinking there a little bit. But I haven't answered Chris's questions about, what should we teach, and how do we teach it? And, what advice could we give to teachers and administrators out there who are listening to Silver Lining, and what are their next steps for this, this new age of generative AI enhanced learning? I'll stop there for a second for my ramblings. Punya.
Lydia, go ahead. Go ahead.
I have a question for all of you. So why do you think there's such a mismatch between the speed of how the world's changing versus the speed of the education changing. Like I know education wants to change, and we always talk about change. Even like when I was a teacher, innovation, we throw these words around a lot. We want to change, we want to innovate, but why? Like we know the world's changing so fast. Why? Like education is always kind of lagging behind into extent.
I have a somewhat contrarian answer to that, which is that's actually smart. We hold on to certain things in education which I think we should let go. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying, but I think change based on whatever the latest technology is the wrong way to go. I think change based on what we want our students to learn, what we things that we value, what we have learned, how best ways of learning are, that it's social, it's communal, it's open, it's public, it's connected to the real world. Those are the kinds of changes we want. I am very skeptical of the sort of the tech bro argument that, oh, you guys have like totally messed this up and I have the magic bullet. Just like Chris said, that is very hard to, capture a complex thing in 6 words, which was sort of unfair of me of, how I positioned him in the discussion. uh, you know, um, but I think that very often in education, most of the people who give solutions are coming at it with the one solution. This is going to fix education once and for all. And the diversity of context, the diversity of learners, the diversity of this, people just don't grasp how complicated this is. So one of the, like I've written a couple of blog posts recently about just the kind of cognitive diversity that we have. There was this wonderful article in the New Yorker, which is about people who do not see images in their heads at all. And they were usually up till 30, 40 years of age before they discovered this, because they thought when somebody said, I see this, I can imagine this and I see my mother's face, they thought this was just metaphorical use of language. I found out when I was in India this time, my closest friend who I have known since 8th grade, he read that article and realized that he was that way. Okay. And so then, we look at just how the different ways I've written this blog post about the different ways these people who won the Fields Medal in mathematics did mathematics. There's 4 people and they did it dramatically 4 different ways. Now you think about a classroom of 25 kids, and somebody to come in and say that we are going to create this bot, or we are going to create X or Y, or we're going to have this one policy, that we are going to have this one way of reading instruction, that phonics is going to be the end all solution. It's batshit crazy. And I think so that's why I feel like at some level, change is needed. I don't disagree with that. But is it change driven by the right reasons, or is it driven by some catchphrase or by some deep misunderstanding of what learning is? That's my sort of instinctual reaction when somebody comes in and says, like, why does education change? It's like, right? I mean, it's not that simple, and I think it's very hard for people to keep that complexity in mind. We tend to run towards simplistic solutions, or solutions that we think will work, and that's always a problem. So, yeah, my 2 cents
So
on that.
building on that, I think there's lessons to be learned from our past episodes in Silver Lining for Learning. I mean, this is show 256. If we take out all the ones that are post-reflect and just look at actual cases, we're still well over 200, maybe over 225. And what do they have in common? Well, I think one thing that many of them have in common is that they're about empowerment. They're about education as empowerment. They're taking a group that's been marginalized and they're saying, what do you want? What do you want for yourself? And then they're saying, okay, let's look at how you can learn things that will make it possible for you to get to go toward that goal. So that's very different than the disciplinary approach that says we have these disciplines, they chunk the world into building blocks, and we're going to teach you some of each discipline. And then if you decide that you want a job in X, we'll teach you a lot of that discipline. What's missing is the faith that if somebody wants something in the real world, and it doesn't have to be something exotic, they want to be a successful farmer, for example, that there's a great deal that many disciplines have to say about that. Economics, biology, chemistry, physics, on and on and on. And a lot of these silver lining for learning episodes have been about how creative teachers found ways to structure knowledge from the discipline so that they spoke to those different individual students. And that's a lot of why education doesn't change, is that we're putting the cart before the horse. The horse is what people want for themselves. The cart is the disciplines that can help them get there. We're saying, well, let's start with the disciplines, and then when you graduate, hopefully you know what you want for yourself after we've stuffed all these just in case things into you. Not working.
Well, you give me an idea of what I'm going to include in my syllabus. Chris, and Punya, thank you. I might just I've had an option in my courses looking at, several of the Silver Lining for Learning episodes and reflecting on them and that so forth. But I think something even more grand than that, and cutting across the 200 episodes that are empowering, that are giving students some identity or self-efficacy through the methodologies chosen, might be worth someone or a group of my students working together as a team and looking at and synthesizing and talking about. I mean, that might be more powerful than having them turn in 4 or 5 assignments, just having one big macro assignment, looking at as many of these episodes as they can and categorizing them and reflecting on what are the principles that are making it effective? What are the characteristics of the people in charge, the leadership, and other skills that we might be able to document from a large sample of Silver Lining for Learning episodes. And I could even have them reflect on and suggest people for future episodes after doing that. I think we could have a large team doing that. I had a couple of years ago, I had 2 large teams creating curriculum for teachers in Puerto Rico as I've mentioned previously in this episode in Silver Lining, after Hurricane Maria and other catastrophes hit Puerto Rico. And we had an episode on Silver Lining about that, actually, several years ago. If anyone's interested, we had a couple teachers and a faculty member down there. So yeah, I'll start working away at that idea, Chris. I'll give you full credit. Punya and Chris, I'll give both you guys credit, and I'll put your emails in there if they want to contact. No. So yeah, thank you for that. That's today's mission. You've given me a mission for today. That's great. And who knows what could come from that. Lydia, you're smiling. You want to give me some ideas to enhance that?
Well, hopefully what I'm going to say might be helpful, but I can't promise that. I just want to say a couple of words of reflecting on what you said, your thoughtful responses to my question about change. I absolutely agree that change for the sake of change, just almost as a marketing strategy, look, we're doing this and we are keeping up with this technology because we need to kind of differentiate ourselves in some ways. I think that kind of change is definitely counterproductive, or trying to find some change, so we can be different. I think those are really counterproductive. And I think what's really beautifully said, I think, Chris, you said, education is about empowerment. And Punya, you said, if there's one thing we've learned from Silver Lining for Learning is that there's no magic bullet or solution for education or for school because it's the complexity, the diversity, and etc. So, and I tying back to like, Chris earlier said, like, think for yourself. I think maybe this is like kind of message for administrators or school leaders and or teachers thinking about what I'm going to do. Like, what is the magic solution in this crazy age of AI? What I'm going to teach? What is going to work for my students? There might be some suggestions and advice from people, but ultimately, these leaders and teachers, administrators have to decide themselves on what works for their context, for their unique students. And there's going to be a lot of try and error, a lot of experimenting, a lot of innovating as a result of that. So I think maybe there's one thing when we think about change in school, it's not like, oh, there's this like broad slogan, oh, we're all going to change in certain ways, there are these mandates, whatever. It's we all are constantly innovating, trying to make things work. And through that, we are changing things, we're innovating, and we are thinking for ourselves, our own context.
You know, when Punya was talking, sorry, Lydia, when Punya was talking, I'm thinking, oh, I need Punya to be my marketing head because I was sitting in Shanghai a couple weeks ago and we're having dinner with Dr. John Lee Zhao from South China Normal University, who translated my World is Open book to Chinese and made it a bestseller in China. I'm going to be hopefully writing a follow-up book, The World is Wide Open. And as Punya is talking about openness being a very important concept that we need to grasp a little bit, in China, they couldn't translate that word open that well. It took many conversations just to figure out how to translate the word open. But I'm thinking about writing a follow-up, Punya, and the way you were discussing it, I think make a good marketing manager for the book. So, none of the book publishers, Houghton Mifflin, Routledge, Springer, Josie Bass, you name it, Wiley, you name it, none of them are pumping any dollars into books anymore. And why does someone even bother getting a publisher, when there are other outlets besides the traditional publishing market. I'm rambling a little bit here, but we've all had experience with different publishers, most of them bad, not good ones. Some good, some bad. But just the way I just thought it was beautiful, Punya. I'm going to go back to the sequence there and listen to it and write it all down because I really thought you captured it well, and I'll put the little testimonial in from you
There you go.
when the book comes out. So
There
thank
you
you,
go.
Punya.
So I have another suggestion for you, and you can give me credit for that or not. Doesn't really matter. Um, so one of the things I've been thinking about is a lot of the discussion around sort of Lydia were talking about AI literacy and media literacy, and all those definitions keep changing about like, can you search the web? Can you do this? Can you do that? Right? But truly, the most important thing that we need to learn is about how our brain works, the biases that we have, whether it's confirmation bias, whether it's recency bias. Large part of the reason why AI like ChatGPT or whatever, Claude or whatever, seems so omniscient and reliable and knowledgeable is a fluency bias. There is documented research to show that if some person just speaks fluently, they are more credible. If they speak confidently, they are more credible. Well, guess what? ChatGPT is always super confident. Plus, it is sycophantic, which is another bias of ours, which is we like people who praise us. So, to me, the most important thing that we can learn is actually start understanding how we know and think. So the IB the IB curriculum has this fantastic course that they teach at the senior year or towards the upper end of high school, which is it's called TOK, Theory of Knowledge. And that whole course is about how do we know what we know? Like, what does it mean to know something? So it comes from skepticism, it comes from curiosity, it comes from understanding ourselves, our biases, understanding the different fields have different ways of knowing. Like what knowing means in music is very different from what knowing means in math. So to understand that there are all of these complexities in that, to me is that's something that I've been really thinking a lot about, that how can one develop a curriculum around that? Because technologies are going to keep changing, but the way our brains work and how we get manipulated by it, whether it's social media or it's cinema. I mean, cinema is a very powerful tool. I mean, if you go back in history and you think about books are very powerful tools for social transformation, or creating horrible things, making horrible things happen. But it all comes down to how our brains work, how we process information, how we deal with peer groups, and how we deal with information. I'm going to trust information coming from the three of you more than some random person on the street. You know, I need to be aware of that and sensitive to that. So one of the things I've been thinking a lot about, that the curriculum that we need for the future, like a key component of that is going to be this, is going to be some form of the theory of knowledge, which can start from almost kindergarten onwards. So I'll give an example. Like when my kids were little, I would ask them this question: why are television programs interesting? And they were like, what kind of a dumb question is that? It's so that we enjoy. I'm like, no. Television programs are interesting so that you will watch the commercials in between. That didn't change what they watched, but it did make them aware of the economic system that underlies television, right? And I think those are the kinds of questions and thinking that we need to bring into our curriculum, much more than sort of what literacy, quote unquote, media, digital, blah, 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 AI, what have you, has focused on. And so that would be another thing, Curt, that I think that would be fantastic for your students to look at, is like, what are the aspects of our cognition? And there's tons of research on it. But it is something that has remained completely in the psychological, social psychological literature, has really not permeated into, the fact that we are frequency thinkers, not probabilistic thinkers, that we have recency bias. I mean, there's so much knowledge that we have about that I think transforms the way we approach the world. Like that we are bad Bayesian thinkers. You know, that's critically important to recognize what it is. Maybe remove the word Bayesian from it because that's just a word. But what does it mean to think in those terms? That's where I think that the real education for the future needs to be thinking about. It's one of the key aspects of that.
As you're
And that's a
chatting,
book that I would love to write. If I find the time,
there you
that's a
go.
book I would love to write.
There you go. Yeah, take a
You
couple
know.
weeks off from Silver Lining. We'll see you at the end of the month,
Yeah.
manuscript in hand.
There you go. There you
As
go.
you're chatting, I'm thinking of David Perkins', Smart Schools book and Howard Gardner's. I have to ask Chris, who are the young and up and coming people at Harvard right now who are the next David Perkins and Howard, or might be the innovators of tomorrow? Are there any people you might want to bring in here from Harvard, Chris, and have a chat about that?
Well, we can talk about that offline, but what I will say is that medicine has a battery of indicators that they use to try to tell you something about your health. You go in for a physical and you get a bunch of blood work and other kinds of measurements that physicians take, and then they show you the normal ranges and where you're outside of the normal ranges and whether you should be worried about that or not, or whether your body is fine. There's nothing like that in education. I mean, we don't have something where when you get to, say, fifth grade, we say, your mind has matured somewhat now. And so we're not going to give you some multiple choice tests, right? We're not going to give you the MMPI personality inventory. We're way beyond that. But for example, for biases, it wouldn't be that hard to construct a kind of a series of encounters that you have through video with different sources, and you indicate which you find compelling and why, and then at the end it gives you some feedback in terms of not that there's some perfect state that you're supposed to be in, and on a scale to 0 to 100 you're 93. It's nothing like that. It's just sort of, here's some information about how your brain works compared to, many other people's brains. Here's how you're distinctive. Here's how you're the same. It wouldn't be hard to do that, but that never even comes up as a question because it's an industrial model. In an industrial model, you don't think about how to customize the assembly line. You think about how to make the assembly line cheaper and faster.
That made me think like, education has always been focusing on like output, like, give a student test, how many questions can they answer correctly? Can they write an essay like in SAT style? It's all about like output. But I think what I heard you say is like we need to return inwards, having students to be more self-aware, like what kind of individual I am,
Mm.
like what kind of biases I have, and then to have that deep self-awareness in order to have good output. But so far we've been really obsessed, like having these standards output, like, oh, my student all scored this amount on this test, rather than really like individualized in terms getting each of them to return inwards, and that's like an internal journey that every student need to take on. And I think we've been overlooking that in education, and I think that's even more critical in the age of AI because students need to be like metacognitively aware of themselves and their interaction with an alien intelligence. So I think
Hmm.
that's even more critical.
Yeah, no, on the exactly. That's a it's kind of interesting. It's like that whole it goes back centuries, right? This idea of know thyself. In some ways, to me, that becomes the most critical piece of the whole thing. Especially with these AI in particular, where the interactions are going to be so much more one-on-one and insulated from the rest of the world. At least in a classroom, there is a teacher who can, catch if you if you have a misconception and point it out, and groups can sort of remove, if you're working in a group together, different opinions, you'll realize that there are different ways of looking at the world, and that helps sort of smooth out some of the rough edges in our thinking. But once the interactions become one-on-one with a technology which is incredibly opaque, it really comes down to my being aware of how my sort of blind spots, so to speak, and our cognitive weaknesses. I mean, bias is a very strong word to use here, so I want to be sensitive to that because that leads us down the way of like, oh, I'm racist or I'm this or that's not what I'm talking about. These are just ways our brains work that we need to be aware of that open us up for both persuasion in good ways and manipulation in bad ways. It's not a black and white thing, which I think bias sometimes makes us feel that this is like a weakness. No, I mean, there is a reason why we tend to think in frequencies rather than probabilities. It made sense millions of years ago. It doesn't make sense today, so on and so forth.
It's like a researcher being aware of the limitations of their own
Right,
study.
exactly. That's great. That's a great analogy. That's a great analogy.
This is also a control freedom issue, right? You know, and over the past decade and a half, I've been researching, why would people use OpenCourseWare from MIT? Why would people contribute to Merlot or other websites to make the world more open for learning? And the number one reason they give me is freedom to learn. You just want freedom, and we're controlling people oftentimes, too often, in the approach to learning, the context one's attempting to learn, the assessment of that learning, of course. We're othering the assessments. Someone's creating the assessments for someone, not utilizing as much self-assessment, pure assessment as we could. So we limit the opportunities for self-directed learning. And in this age, that's misguided. I mean, if there's one answer to Chris's question earlier about how do we foster the skills that we need in this century, it's got to be finding pathways and principles for self-directed, in particular, online learning, formal and informal. Um, but, we want to control. People want to pin down. They want to be able to state, what have they learned? When have they learned it? In what path have they learned it? You know, and this is increasingly problematic as the pathways for learning increase, as the opportunities proliferate. We're still trying to pin down where it's going to happen, when it's going to happen, with whom it's going to happen with, how it's going to happen. And, we should be fostering in our teacher education programs an appreciation of the multiple paths that students will have in front of them to learn, and giving the pre-service teachers a sense of that through challenging them to create curriculum that provides those opportunities. I see we're getting near the end of time. We have time for maybe one or two more comments before we do a wrap up. I think everyone should have a final say, but Chris wants to jump in here before we do any final wrap up. Chris.
Well, I'm happy to make this part of the final wrap up, but as I look across the 256 programs, another theme that I see beyond empowerment is empathy. That so many of these programs are about people who are going the extra mile for other people because they feel a tremendous empathy, and they see a group that's marginalized. They can imagine themselves in their shoes, and then they work very hard to try to get beyond that. And I think that Harvard seems to be a good example of a university that's pretty good at teaching people to think, but that creates people with zero empathy, many of whom are now screwing up the world. And because of that complete lack of empathy. And that's maybe something that can be learned but not taught, which is another interesting topic in terms of the curriculum and instructional design and so on, that there are things that can be learned but not taught. And I just think that that's something else that we need to all think about as we help others to learn. Are we helping them to learn in a way that leads them to care about other people and to have service as part of their lives?
So we'll be coming back to Chris for introducing the next show. Lydia.
I deeply resonate with what Chris said. If people ask me what is worth learning in the age of AI, I won't even say AI literacy. I would say things like empathy, having good character, ethical thinking. Like these things, I think are paramount. And all the other skills you can develop, but being a good person, I think, is the most important thing, because we are have these technology now is really accessible to everyone, and it will amplify any kind of internal world that we have, whether it's good or bad. If we're good inside, it's going to amplify that tenfold. If it's, has some questionable characteristics, and that will also amplify. So I really think like kind of return to these things. These things like citizenship, character education, we kind of like these are the soft subjects in education nobody really pay much attention to. I think that need more spotlight.
Punya.
So I think, Chris, I love just seconding what Lydia said. I love what you said. And I think that the piece that I was talking, I actually made a note to myself here, because this piece I was talking about was about knowing yourself. But knowing yourself is meaningless if you don't see yourself in a relational way with other people, right? And so to me, that's the yin to the yang, so to speak. And that becomes the complete thing. It's not just knowing yourself, but seeing yourself in others. And that's the core of empathy. So I love that. So thank you. Thank you for that. So I think good. I have nothing more to add. That's wonderful. Curt?
I forgot earlier, and Lydia talked about computer or AI literacy being on the tip of the tongues of all teachers today and all administrators. In a couple of weeks, we'll have Justin Reich, who wrote a piece for the Chronicle of Higher Education and has a new guidebook for schools about this AI literacy issue, and one of his colleagues there at MIT in a lab, teaching and learning lab there. So we have that to look forward to. I wanted to say, Thank you to our listeners and viewers out there in the ether, in listening to us as they're in their cars, on their bicycles, wherever they happen to be. Silver Lining for Learning is our gift to the world. It's our Christmas gift to provide to all of you. Now, you might not get a Christmas card from me, but we are providing at least 40 shows every year, sometimes 44 shows within a particular year. And we're always looking for new ideas. So if you have ideas for us, if you know who, what, and where, and when, who should we bring in? What topics should we be discussing? When in the cycle of shows should we put someone on? If you do have suggestions, we're all ears. We'd love to hear from you. Uh, we'd love maybe entertain an idea from you to include you in the show. You might be someone who's looking to talk about your latest innovation or project or initiative in the education space that is providing a silver lining for learning for a particular region of the world, or a school system, or wherever it is. We love to entertain the ideas out there. Before we turn over for Chris for the next show, I must say, during the coming week, if you get a chance, next Friday, Indiana University is on TV in the semifinals for football. So please, if you need a shirt, write to me. I'll be happy to buy one for you and send it to you. So Hoosiers out there.
Right.
Chris, my fellow Midwesterner, will introduce the next show. Chris.
Well, one of the things beyond empathy and empowerment that Silver Lining for Learning is about is technology. And frequently on shows, we feature where the cutting edge of technology is right now and new things that are possible, doing better things rather than just doing things better. Next week's show is an example of that. It's about how teacher education is becoming better because you can rehearse. You can rehearse reality using a combination of AI and XR. And I think the synthesis of AI and XR is one of the really exciting things that's at the cutting edge right now of what's going on. So I hope that you'll tune in Saturday the 10th and learn more about that.